And so, very interesting the things that James has to say. Kind of by way of overview, here's what you find in the letter. Okay, the first chapter really addresses two main issues. The first having to do with patience in difficulty. Okay, patience in circumstance. It's the trying of your faith works patience passage and section. The great admonition that is here, besides the fact that we need to have a proper attitude about our difficulties, and that is one of the great applications. But the other one is, and one that's probably less underscored, is we need to be asking God to help us to be wise in such circumstances. In fact, as I was going back over it, trying to kind of review some of this and making some notes for today, one of the things that struck me over and over is how much James emphasizes attention to God, whether it's attention to God in prayer, like in chapter 1, he tells us in verse 5, if any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God. So he doesn't get 2 or 3 sentences into this letter before he's already focusing our attention upon our relationship with God and this help that God is willing to offer. And that runs through the whole letter, whether it is asking for wisdom, whether it's an appeal to God, that we remember Him in our daily lives. Over and over and over, James is telling us to have this kind of an intimate relationship with God. I'll tell you why I think that's interesting. I don't know how the common Jew thought about God under the old law. Clearly there were some, and perhaps most, we just don't know. It's kind of hard, even if you read the literature, to determine what things were like for the average person. Most of the literature was written by rabbis, by teachers, and they're discussing issues, they're discussing doctrinal views, they're discussing the traditions that they've had. But you know, what was life like for a common person, just an average person like you and I, under the old law? Not a teacher, not a priest, not a Levite. And you have glimpses. For instance, Jesus tells the parable of the publican and the Pharisee. You remember that parable? What are they both doing? They're both praying. So they've gone to the temple for the purpose of a specific conversation with God. Now here's what's curious to me. Did they only do that when they went to the temple? Under the old law, did they think of relationship with God and prayer to God like James says here over and over and over through the whole book? Look to God for this, look to God for that, pray to God for this, pray to God for that. Under the old law, was everything kind of centered around the temple service or the tabernacle service? Now we know it wasn't that way, for instance, with David, but David seems to be kind of an exception in my mind. And so I'm kind of curious, and I don't have an answer to this, I just bring it up because I find it curious. Here's a very early letter that puts great emphasis upon a kind of a daily willingness to consider God's activity and to speak to God. Was that something new for these people? That I am detaching my relationship with God from a formal expression that always has to center around a certain place. And now I can talk to God anywhere. I can talk to God about anything. I can be very intimate in my relationship with God, in my connection, in my conversation. To us, that's normal, right? At least I hope it is. I hope you think about your service to God and talking to God and thinking about God outside the church building. But I'm curious as to whether or not that this was something that was typical in James's day, or whether or not he says all this so many times because he's trying to get these people into a new mode of thinking. I find that curious. Do you find that curious, or is that just one of these, yeah, well, it doesn't matter, Russ. You know, you're just looking for information to fill a class. That strike you at all? No? Yes? Dennis? Yeah, okay, I got 3 hands, so I'll take them in order. Dennis? Yeah. 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 And that's true. But even Daniel is offered very often among scholars as an example of the fact that the Jews thought in terms of regimented ways of worshiping. Morning prayers, noon prayers, evening prayers, 3 times a day. Remember the Pharisee, again, in the parable. I pray to you 3 times a day. I fast twice a week. Did they think of their relationship with God outside of that? Which is a curiosity to me. Because if anything, James is telling us in the entire letter, what he's saying is, you need to be involved with God constantly in your life, whether it's communication or consideration. Phyllis? You. Well, I think that predominantly had to do with the sacrifices that they made, okay, and the feast days that they observed. These times where God commanded certain activities of formal worship, okay. You also find, however, very early that God, even in the first few chapters, I have to remember where it is. It's in Exodus 21, 2, 3, somewhere in there, that he even talks about common altars, that they could make common altars. And I think some sacrifices, like a thank offering or a peace offering, that they could offer in other places, but not sin offerings, burnt offerings, because those required a priest's intervention. So I really don't know, and that's why it's a curiosity to me. It may very well be that, and this happens, it may very well be that worship became more ritualistic and formalistic over years for the Jews. This may not register with you, but in the prophet Zechariah, after the children of Israel have come back from captivity, they send word to the priests and asked if they're supposed to be weeping. Do we continue weeping in the 5th and the 7th month? Well, those were commemorations of the attack upon Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem. God never demanded those times of sorrow, but it had become so commonplace that they send and ask the priest, do we keep weeping? Which is always a curiosity to me, because only actors weep on command. Okay, today is a sad day, let's all cry. That's kind of the question. And God's response to that is, did I ever command you to do that to begin with? Are you doing this for me or not for me? So I think it's very possible that God may have not been as ritual in his initial demands, other than certain sacrifices, but that it became such. I don't know that. I'm just proposing that as a possibility. And now you get to Christianity. And once again, we're trying to take God, and I say, not take him out of the temple, but not limit him to the temple. Does that make sense? And that may be a completely change of thought for a Jew. And not just for the Jew, but for Gentiles as well, who would have associated their God with their temple worship. Just a second, John Tom. Betsy, you had your hand up? Yes, yes. Yes. Yeah. 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 Can everybody hear what Betsy's saying? Okay. Yes. Yeah, and that's a great comparison, because I can't help but think that James is writing to people who have come out of more of a structured relationship like that, and that he is just constantly saying, look, you need to ask God about this, you need to talk to God about that, you need to seek God for this, you need to remember God for this. Sometimes our own structures and formality can get in the way of a true relationship and understanding God in our life. John Tom?
Well, something nations do it as a whole.
Yeah.
But it's, tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right.
But it's more about you as an individual, as a Christian, what your responsibility is.
Yeah.
Not as a congregation or a group of people as a whole.
Yeah, and that's a good observation because the Jews thought of themselves and their relationship with God as being a result of their nationality. It's a national covenant, maybe not as much an individual covenant. So that's a good observation. Those things certainly go together. Larry? Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. In fact, that was the next thing I was going to ask is, okay, these are great observations. What do they mean to us individually? I mean, we take these thoughts that we're talking about, and they're fun to kick around, just kind of academically, theoretically. But what do we take from that? Well, Larry just kind of hit upon that. James is giving them admonitions, things that they need to be doing as individuals. And so the question for all of us is, are we doing what James tells us to do in the first chapter? Are we choosing to count it joy when you fall into different kinds of temptations, testing of our faith? That's not a normal reaction, but it is the reaction of a disciple of Jesus because we see how that can cause us to think heavenward and not just think in regards to the here and now. And we're right back to the consideration of God in our daily lives. And I really think that this is lost even on faithful Christians sometimes, that we go through life and our mind is not always on spiritual things. And before somebody says, well, wait a minute, you're a preacher, you get to think about spiritual things all the time. You never have to think about anything else. I've got a job. I work in the hospital. I work in the plant. I do this. I do that. I can't think about spiritual things all the time. Yes, you can. Okay? It is not the specific thought. It's the big context of all of your thoughts, where the idea is that you set your mind on things above and not on things of the earth. Yeah, we all have our jobs. I had to mow the yard yesterday, okay? Because we're having the young people over. I don't want you to think that I don't take care of my place, all right? So I had to mow the yard yesterday. Had to trim the yard. I do the edging with my weed eater, all right? I don't have an edger. You ever try to edge your yard next to the driveway with the weed eater, okay? If you are walking the same direction that the weed eater is turning, what happens if you get it too close to the ground? Huh? Yeah, it grabs it, doesn't it? Does it grab it in a straight line? No, it'll cut decorations all over your yard. Okay, I am not walking the edge of the driveway thinking, this reminds me of the straight and the narrow in Matthew. Okay, I'm focused on, I need to make sure I don't walk that way because I made that mistake 5 minutes ago, and now I got a place over there I need to try to fix because I've cut a big chunk out of my grass. Okay, but in the big picture of things, it doesn't matter what my grass looks like, and I'm aware of that. Okay, but for some people, everything in life is the end-all, be-all. And so this idea of, what do I do with this? Am I every day going, when I go through difficulties, does it register to me that this ought to drive me to a greater appreciation of heaven? This is where we're going. This is why we rejoice in trial. Mark sent me a text this morning. The young man in Nacogdoches we mentioned a few weeks ago, Case Opperman, put it on the Facebook bulletin board, has Hodgkin's lymphoma. Do you remember seeing that post? And he sent a note to the church thanking us for his prayers because he's been able to get started on his treatment earlier than he thought. Very, very spiritually minded young man, clearly appreciative of people's prayers. And I look at Case, and he's a great kid. I really like Case and his wife. But I'm going to tell you what Case needs to be focused on right now. Whatever health issues he's having just ought to cause him to be that much more excited about heaven. And that's the way spiritual focus works. So, I'm preaching here, okay? I will offer an invitation if you want me to, but back to the application of James. What are we doing with this stuff? Are we rejoicing in trial knowing that patience, if it works what it's supposed to, it causes us to be complete and to lack nothing? Because we don't get caught up in all the garbage of this life, because we are looking for something greater. And so, what are you doing with this prayer stuff that we're talking about, with this individual stuff, this intimacy with God that we've spent the last 5 or 10 minutes talking about? So, that's something has to be, we can't just leave this discussion right here and go on and say, well, that was kind of interesting. I've never thought about those things. Regardless of whether the Jews in James's day did anything with this, question is, what are you doing with it? What am I doing with it? Also, I would mention, and something else I put in chapter 1, is that he introduces this thought in verse 18, and this is a very Jewish thought. Of his own will he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Peter starts his letter in 1 Peter this way. There's a sense in which Paul, when he writes to the Ephesians, starts his letter this way, talking about being born of God or being begotten of God. Here it is, brought us forth by the word of truth. It is the first fruits part that's very Jewish, because God demanded of the children of Israel that the first of their produce in the field would be sacrificed to God. And so James borrows on this thought. You are, as Christians, especially in James's day among these early Jewish Christians, you're the first fruits of the gospel being planted in the world. And you need to understand what that means. It means that you are particularly dedicated to God. So you get to verse 19 and you get all this practical stuff. Therefore, and we're back to the individual responsibility that John Tom mentioned, be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. I love that passage. I'm not very good at that passage, but I love that passage. This is what God expects of His people. These are the kind of people we are supposed to be. And I tell you, if you're patient with circumstances, this swift to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath thing becomes a whole lot easier. But notice that he goes on. Laying aside all filthiness and overflowing of weakness, receive with meekness the implanted word. Is that our disposition about the Bible, about our study, about worship, about Bible classes, about preaching and teaching, about our singing? Is our attitude toward the Word that, hey, this is the most important source of information in my life, and I need to be attentive to it? Or do we just kind of do the bare minimum? I was teaching all these young men a couple weeks ago, and I had to, did I tell you this already? I had my class, I was the only one that had class outside. So, you know, it's 400 degrees, we're all sweating, and they're watching every bug and robin and cardinal. I mentioned this to somebody. One class, I noticed 3 or 4 boys looking over my shoulder, and they're just rapt in their attention. They're not rapt in me, in the study. They are rapt in whatever's behind me, and I turn around, and I'm like, what are y'all looking at? Oh, there were 3 cardinals. And I sat there for a minute, and I thought, have you guys never seen a red bird before? Yeah, but there were 3 cardinals. And my thinking about that was, surely we've got enough focus that we can find things that are important and keep our minds off of things that are unimportant. And you know what I've decided? No, we can't. Why not? Here's the serious question from that. Why not? Why do we have such a hard time receiving with meekness the implanted word that is saving our souls? That we can't give discipline and focus enough to make important things really important and keep them prioritized. You know, it's easy to read through this stuff and not think about, hey, I'm not very good at this. You know, when it comes to my Bible reading, I may do it half the time, and the other time I just forget, or I've got other important things and I'm not making time for it. Or when I am reading and I'm not really reading it, I'm just checking the box because I need to make sure I get it done today. And I tell you, folks, this is, you know, God didn't inspire James to write verse 21 just because he thought that in the English that's going to sound pretty cool. Receive with meekness the implanted word which is able to save your souls. There's some great literature right there. But that's not why God wrote it. And so I look at that kind of stuff, and once again, I don't know how many of these people had access to this letter. It would have been probably copied and distributed, so I would suspect a lot of churches in that day had a copy of James's letter. Whether it was accessible for the average person to go just, hey, can I read like James's, can I take it home for a week? I doubt that they did that. I don't know who kept them. I don't know how all that worked. What I do know is when they had the opportunity to look at it and read it, because it was God's word from an inspired apostle and possibly from the Lord's own brother, don't you think it was probably significant to them? And it needs to be significant to us. So the last part of James, chapter 1, I think goes underappreciated. We're good at the focus on the trying of our faith and how temptation works. And we're real good at this is not offering scriptural justification for orphans' homes. Okay, but most of the time with James 1, we don't stop and think about the latter admonition there. So I want to encourage you. I think if there's a part that's not emphasized in chapter 1, it would be probably verse 18 through 25. And it's not a mistake that in that section he says, look, you got to be doers of the word, not hearers. You're looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing what you really are and then just walking away and forgetting it. That's not the way discipleship is supposed to work. So, questions, comments? You didn't know there was that much in chapter 1 that we didn't talk about, did you? You give a preacher free rein, folks, and you're in trouble. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Yeah. And that's exactly right. It goes to really the theme of God's call to man. You know, we think of God's call to man, the theme is salvation. Well, I'm going to tell you, God's call to man, the theme is repentance. You got to change. Now, I'll fix it where you can change and that your sins aren't going to keep you out of heaven. But you got to do the changing. And that's the hard part. And that's exactly right. That is what this last little section is calling us. You're the first fruits, especially to them. You are the initial harvest to God out of the world, so live like it. And, you know, we talk about evangelism and what can we do. And I'm going to talk about it a little bit in the lesson this morning. And some people say, you know, I'm not very good at talking to people. I'm not very good at meeting people. That's my great challenge, is the initial get them to the table part of evangelism. And we all have our issues when we go. I don't care how good or not good you are at certain aspects of evangelism. Here's something everybody can do. You can be the first fruits of God's people with such attention to the implanted word that not only are you living it, you're doers of the word, not hearers only, but you're so familiar with it, if anybody ever asks you a question, you can at least answer it. I think that's our issue sometimes. We know we're supposed to be good influences, but if somebody says, why do you live the way you live, we don't know how to answer that question. And I'm going to tell you why. Because we just spend too much time in front of TV or in front of our cell phones and not enough time with the Bible. And that's the hard answer, but it is the answer. Good observation, a call to repentance. Anybody else in James 1 before we move to the second chapter? Okay, James 2. So we're not even going to finish the review this morning. James 2, probably the most well-known section as a chapter. First of all, we just can't be biased. And once again, for the Jews, think about 1,500 years of the law of Moses and how God separated the Jews from all the other nations. Okay? And He did so intentionally so He could bring about the Messiah. There was a reason that God did this the way that He did it. But then when the Messiah came into the world, salvation's for everyone, and there is no Jew or Gentile in Christ's kingdom. How hard that would have been for the Jews in the first century, Jewish Christians, to change their views. And even the Gentiles to change their views against the Jews. Don't you know they hated the Jews because of the way the Jews treated them? And so you can't have respect of persons. I think every culture deals with this. Ours certainly does on a number of levels. Whether it is, as he mentions here, rich and poor, which we do, we have it. Whether it is moral bias, whether it is racial bias, whether it is nationality. See a lot of it in regards to the immigration issues right now. For some people, it's not an issue of legal or illegal. There's some people just don't want foreigners in this country. Okay? And as Christians, James is very clear that this is not the way that we just can't have faith and show respect of persons. And he goes from that very naturally to saying you have faith and not showing it in the way that you live is just dead. It's not faith at all. Okay, so that's the section of James we're probably the most familiar with. Gets to chapter 3, really changes subject somewhat, starts talking about the tongue. But I think the key to James 3 and the first half of James 4 is you need to be careful about this desire to be teachers. And once again, it's not a good desire that he's mentioning that I want to help people come to a knowledge of the truth. He talks a lot about envy, self-seeking, ambition. Clearly what he's got in mind is people who want to be seen as important. So he offers the warning about the tongue, which we all probably need to pay careful attention to. But to me, the bigger part of the chapter is verse 13. How are you going to measure who really is wise and understanding among God's people? Who really needs to be teaching? Is it the person that's just ambitious because they want to be seen? I have heard preachers say, if anybody's up preaching, I want to be the one doing it. And I find that kind of distasteful. But I have heard that with my own ears. And there is an ambition that sometimes people have, especially in religious organizations, because that's the most influence most of us have in our lives. You know, if you're in a congregation of 150 people, you have influence with 150 people. I mean, how many of you have influence with 150 people on your job? Very few. And so this idea of turning the gospel into a place of ambition. The apostles dealt with it. Jesus dealt with them all the time. Don't you know James, in his life, heard Jesus have these conversations? And so, where is real wisdom? It's not bitter envy and self-seeking. That's earthly and sensual and demonic. Every evil thing is there. When he gets over to chapter 4, he mentioned you have all these problems among yourselves, and it's because of this kind of thinking. And so that's a very powerful section in James that I think probably all of us need to give some attention to from time to time. It's very easy to use a local congregation to find ways to build up your own ego. Okay? The last part of chapter 4 is this appeal. It's an odd kind of change. This appeal to remember God in daily activities, I find it a very compelling part of James, and maybe again one that we don't pay enough attention to, where he says, "Come now, you who say today or tomorrow we'll go to such and such a city," and we're really good about this. You know, I've got Emily's going through this right now. She's about to finish school, and she's taking a job in Lubbock, and so she's thinking this, thinking that, going to do this, going to do that, got all these plans, looking for a place to stay, got to get this, and there's just all kinds of plans going on. And I look at, you know, like Baylor and Bella and about to head off to college, and just, that's the way our mind goes. And then if you're in the business world, that's the way business works, isn't it? You always have to be thinking a little ahead about your business. Those of you who are close to retirement, we are really good at planning things out. And James's admonition here is, you are foolish if you don't consider God in all of these issues. Life is a vapor. It appears for a little while and vanishes away. If you're gonna go do things, you better make sure that if the Lord wills. In other words, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, taking into consideration the possibility that this is not the way my life's going to work out, or that God has other things, or that life's going to interfere in certain ways. We're once again back to spiritual thinking, okay? And so I would encourage all of us, because I think we all do this, that as we are living our lives and as we are making our plans and doing our things and raising our families and moving on with life, James's admonition is, you better think about God, because he who knows to do good and doesn't do it is sinning. We don't think that way, do we? Do you think, okay, I'm making plans but I forgot God, do you think of that as a sin? Probably not typically. But James says that's exactly what it is. And that takes us to the last chapter, where James offers these warnings to people who are misusing God's people, especially because of their wealth. And once again, this is not something that we deal with much, but it is something that Christians at times have dealt with. And it may happen again, folks. I mean, do you think our government is just becoming more honest and righteous? You know, mercy sakes. I'm not a political animal, and I didn't watch the debate the other day, but somebody put a headline saying, "Man, I hope nuclear war gets here fast." And their point was, you know, when you look at the direction things are going, annihilation might be a better option. And that was their, which I found funny, and it was intended to be in jest. But my point is this, I mean, it could very well be a short period of time before we're all exposed to injustice and corruption that we have to deal with personally, because we're trying to be godly. It is so foreign to our thinking, because for 200 years it's really not been a part of this country's history, but it could. That was something that I tried to emphasize to these kids in the class 2 weeks ago. Peter tells his readers, you better be ready to defend yourself. And I would say it to our kids, you better be ready to defend yourself, because I hate it that it might happen, because I got kids and grandkids. But you just don't know what kind of injustice you're going to face. So James chapter 5 may become very, very practical for a lot of us. And he ends in many ways in the same way that he began. You need to be patient with this. You need to be patient with these people. You need to look to God. You need to be praying for one another. You need to be taking advantage of one another. You need to remember the prophets. You need to remember Job. You need to be patient. But he ends it the way he started. You need to be looking to God. And so if I was going to summarize James with all of the practical things he said, I think the conclusion I would come to at this point, after studying again this time, is you need to be patient and keep your eyes on God. I just find that James comes back to one or the other of those thoughts repeatedly through the letter. Okay? Minute or two. Questions, comments? Okay. I hope the class has been profitable to you. John, did you nothing? Okay. Thank you for being involved. This class will begin 1 Thessalonians Wednesday night. Okay, so we'll do a bit of an introduction because our new quarter starts this week.